All right, everyone. I'd like to introduce our guest. Dr. Erika Kidd is an assistant professor of Catholic Studies and director of the graduate program in Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. A native Iowan, Dr. Kidd studied philosophy, Latin, and Greek text at Baylor University in Texas and received her PhD in philosophy from Villanova University in Pennsylvania. She studies and writes on Augustine and the Augustinian tradition, and she teaches interdisciplinary courses on happiness, creation, and redemption, and Augustine's Confessions. She is currently working on a book about Augustine's short dialogue with teacher and the question, why do we talk to each other? She also has an upcoming lecture, which is on March 21st at 6:30 p.m. on loving and losing at St. Thomas. So if you have any questions about that, please ask her afterwards. But we'd like to give a St. Dunstan's welcome to Dr. Kidd.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I think I have a certain advantage in that it's too cold for me to leave the church, so you have to stay here and listen to me. So I'm grateful for that help from the weather. I'm also really grateful to Erika and to Father Chris for the invitation to come here and speak with you. I love Augustine. I love talking about Augustine. And it's also a great pleasure to be here with this community in particular. As I was telling them, my father-in-law's father was an Anglican priest. My brother is seeking ordination in the Anglican Communion. And so I have a lot of respect for your tradition, and I'm really grateful that you're willing to be here and listen to what I have to say about Augustine. I'm also on the tail end of a cold, so if you want to say a little prayer that my voice makes it all the way through, I'd be grateful for that too. Erika asked me to speak on Augustine's life, which I'm going to do a little bit, but I also know that you're reading the Confessions, and so Augustine's going to tell you himself about his life. So rather than spending our entire time together talking about Augustine's life, what I'd like to do is give you some setup for thinking about how to read the Confessions well. The first time I read the Confessions, I was 17, and I hated it. I thought it was not particularly well written. I mean, remember back to when you were 17, what that was like.
I wasn't reading the Confessions.
I had to read it for college. So I was reading it, and part of the problem was, I was 17, it was called the Confessions, and it sounded really juicy, like what 17-year-old doesn't want to hear about what confessions, what someone else was doing that was bad. And it was just so dreary. There were so many prayers, and the prayers seemed unrelated to the story of this man's life, and it just seemed like these sort of boring, pious interludes, and I, not being especially pious at 17, didn't care. So, and everyone kept telling me, this man is a great rhetorician. And I thought, no, he's not. He wanders all over the place. There are all these digressions. What's going on in this text? And so if I can accomplish nothing else today, my hope is that I will give you, I will be able to encourage you to put some trust in Augustine, that he really knows what he's doing in his arrangement of his text. And my hope is that you will be less impatient readers of Augustine than I was. So the Confessions is, as I'm going to explain to you, a deeply personal book, but it's also a deeply theological book. And for Augustine, the personal and the theological go together in a way that many of us are not accustomed to or haven't encountered. And so I want to give you some sense of what he's doing with that. So first, I'm going to talk to you about Augustine's life and his overall project, for those of you especially who don't know anything about who Augustine is. And then I'm going to have you grab, did everyone get, well, I don't have one, but did everyone get, I don't need one, a handout? You should have a photocopied handout of the first couple pages of the Confessions. And I'm going to help you start reading the Confessions, just the first couple of pages. And I don't have any kind of watch or clock, so maybe, Erika, could you kind of give me warnings when we're getting like 10-minute, 15-minute, 10-minute warning, that kind of thing. All right, great. So first, Augustine's life and project. So Augustine was born in 354 in Tagaste, which is modern-day Algeria, which, as you remember, is in North Africa. So we often see him depicted as, you know, a sort of stereotypical Western European looking man. Some people have argued that he was actually quite a bit darker, and we should be thinking of him in terms of that North African kind of aspect. And his North Africa was Roman. Carthage at this point in history had been conquered by Rome, and so his North Africa was always looking north to Rome. And Rome was sort of the sophisticated place. If all you knew was North Africa, then you were a little bit backwards and backwater. And Augustine, as he started to get more and more education, ultimately he was able to go to Rome and work in Rome. And this gave him a kind of sophistication among his peers, which was part of the reason that he was made bishop when he went back home to North Africa, because people thought, well, this is someone who knows the situation in Rome, who's acquainted with the empire, and doesn't just have this kind of backwater North African experience. This is probably also the place, speaking about the Roman influence, to say something about Virgil. Have any of you happen to have read Virgil's Aeneid? Okay, a couple of people. Virgil's Aeneid is all over the place in the Confessions, and Augustine was really influenced by his reading of Virgil. And you'll see there are places in the Confessions where he describes himself more or less as Aeneas. Sometimes he describes himself more or less as Dido, so he has that Roman poet. Virgil was a Roman poet in the background. Augustine was born to a pagan father and a Christian mother, and he was born after Constantine's conversion. So it was during his lifetime in 380 that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Imperium. And 10 years after that, pagan worship was outlawed. So he's at this point where Christianity is really gaining a foothold, but then when he dies, the Roman Empire looks to be less than eternal. It looks like it's not going to be this eternal empire that everyone was hoping for. When he died in 430, he died in Hippo of a fever as the Vandals were besieging the city. So you had the Vandals coming in, taking over the city that was a stronghold of the Roman Empire. I don't want to be political, but I'll say I often find consolation reading Augustine at this point in history. He's struggling with realizing that the beautiful civilization that he was a part of, that the strong civilization, the noble civilization that he was a part of, had some cracks in it and was suffering some incursion from the outside. So I think he's a timely author. As you will read in the Confessions, he taught and worked as a rhetorician before his conversion. And so he was tasked with speaking well, with making speeches on behalf of the empire. And he'll talk to you about that, so I don't think I have to. But there are a couple other things that were really important in his life that he's not going to talk very much about that you need to be alerted to. One is that he had a long-term relationship with a woman that he never names. She's going to get just a few pages in the Confessions, but you need to know that about him to understand him well. They had a long-term committed relationship. I probably shouldn't explain it right now, but email me if you have questions about the exact details of the relationship between marriage and concubinage and whatnot. I can fill you in, or recommend some good articles to you. But so he had this long-term relationship with a woman, and his mother. This is so much a book about psychology, about family relations. His mother told Augustine, "This woman is never going to be good enough for you. You have to get rid of her and marry someone who's more suitable to your standing." And so Augustine, to his shame, sends away this woman that he'd had a long-term partnership with and that he had fathered a child with. That child is named Adeodatus, and anybody have any idea what that means? Anyone with some Latin? So Adeodatus. So what does Deo mean?
God.
From God, yeah. Yeah, sometimes means without, but in this case, from. So Adeodatus. It might even be, Adeodatus. So the datus is given. I actually named my son Theodore, which is the Greek version of that. It also means gift of God, after Augustine's son. But Augustine's son grows up to be about 15 or 16 and then dies. So all these things have happened before Augustine writes the book that you're going to read. He has this long-term relationship, he breaks it off, and his son dies as a teenager. Augustine wrote his Confessions in 397 at the age of 43. It's also important for you to know he didn't write this at the end of his life. He wrote it midway through his life. He wrote it 10 years after his baptism, and 6 years after becoming a priest, 2 years after becoming bishop, and 15 years before starting work on the city of God. And if you ask people about Augustine, the two works you'll hear, maybe the three works you'll hear about most frequently are the Confessions, the city of God, where Augustine talks a lot about ecclesiology and the relationship between the earthly city that we see and the heavenly city. And then you'll also hear people sometimes talk about on Christian doctrine, which is about hermeneutics. Anyway, Augustine, when he was asked to become a priest, this was not what he had in mind. After he became a Catholic, what he wanted to do, or after he joined the church, what he wanted to do was go out with a bunch of his male friends and talk about philosophy and learn about theology and grow in his faith. And instead what happens, and he'll fill you in a little bit on this, instead what happens is he ends up going back to his hometown, and everyone says, Augustine, you've become a Christian and you have such great rhetorical skills. What we need is for you to become a priest. And so we know that he wept through his ordination ceremony. I don't know if Father Chris wept through his ordination. You guys did. No, it's not something you see very often. Maybe the mother's weeping, but no one else is weeping usually. But Augustine was weeping. This is not what he wanted. And then when he became bishop, he ended up basically playing the role of sort of a judge for a small claims court. So he had this standing within the community. He wasn't just writing and preparing homilies. He was also dealing with, someone stole my chickens, or someone's property line is on my property line. And all he wanted, because you're going to see he's a great intellect, all he wanted, I have a small child, I get this feeling sometimes too, all he wanted was just a little peace and quiet to think and to study. And so he wrote the Confessions for a few different reasons. First of all, he just wanted to make sure that he was building into his day, to speak kind of loosely, building into his day some time to reflect on where he had been, because he was so busy getting swept up into where he was going, and he wanted to think back about where he had been. He also wanted to tell his story to his community, because you can imagine people thinking like, oh, this guy had a sexual relationship with a woman for 10 years and fathered a child and had this big shot career in Milan. And, you can imagine people being a little bit skeptical. And is he now just trying to do some social climbing within the church? And so he wants to tell people in his congregation, people in the diocese, and people just in the community about his story so that they can understand who he is. So he has this sort of private desire to write, but also good public reasons to write this book. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book. Should I stop for questions, or should we do questions at the end? Questions at the end. Oh, great. So this book is considered, Augustine's Confessions is considered the first autobiography of the West. It is also a prayer, and one of the difficult things about reading this book is that you are listening to Augustine pray to God, and one of the things you have to figure out is what is the point of listening to someone else pray, and what is the point of listening to someone else confess, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This book is also an act of memory. This isn't Augustine's journal. It's not what he wrote down every single day. It's what Augustine, as a 43-year-old man, remembers and wants to say about his life, starting right with the time that he was an infant. So keep that in mind too. This is the story he tells as a 43-year-old man. And in this book, he's working as a psychologist, as a rhetorician, as a philosopher, and as a theologian. And for him, all these things work together. All these things stand together. This is part of the reason why I found myself in an interdisciplinary program. I'm trained as a philosopher, but I now teach interdisciplinary courses. And part of that's because I spent so long reading Augustine that for me, the divisions between disciplines just stopped making very much sense anymore. And so now I read as a philosopher with a theological bent, etc. And as I told you, my hope is that you will understand that Augustine isn't just falling into pious interludes when he starts to pray. Instead, he wants us to see an essential connection between his prayers and the story that he wants to tell us. I'll say more about that in a minute. Finally, this is the last thing I'll say about Augustine the man, but just, this is sort of the intro to who Augustine was. In terms of theology, he has made major contributions to our Christian understanding of grace, ecclesiology, original sin. Sometimes Augustine is called the father of the doctrine of original sin. It was around before him, but he articulates it really clearly. He writes a lot about hermeneutics, that is to say, how to interpret texts. He did much to shape our understanding of Genesis, and many more things, and these are just a few of the things. And his writing is voluminous. We have a lot of his letters, many of his homilies. Apparently, he was a very dynamic homilist, and sometimes you'll see him almost yelling at the congregation, or you'll read these comments like, all right, pay attention, or this is really important. So it would have been fun to see him preaching. But many of his theological insights came out of controversy. So when you hear Augustine talked about, you'll sometimes hear him talked about in relation to two heretical groups. The Donatists, and the thing about the Donatists was, Augustine interacts with them sort of early in his career. They more or less thought that the church had to be perfectly pure, that the church could only include saints, and most importantly, that only people who were perfect saints were able to dispense the sacraments. So that would work out all right in a church like yours, where you have Father Chris, who is already perfectly holy. But for a lot of other people, it was a serious concern. And so Augustine writes many things against them, saying, no, look, we don't have to be holy. We don't have to be perfect at this point. We're being made holy. Augustine also writes, especially later in his career, against the Pelagians. Now, the Pelagians' basic thought was that our human nature is untainted by original sin, and that we have within us, basically unaided by divine grace, the power to act well. So they said, you don't need to be relying on grace. It's like this very kind of self-confident kind of pose, right? You aren't fallen in a way that's affected your intellect and your will, the Pelagians would say. You still have within you all the resources that you need to live perfectly, even apart from an infusion of divine grace. And Augustine says, no, that's not right at all. And so, especially late in his life, Augustine writes a lot about grace. So that's a thumbnail sketch of Augustine. I encourage you, if you want to go deeper, to take a look at Peter Brown's biography, which is the standard. It's huge. But it's really well written, and it's fun to read. And so if you want to get a little bit stronger sense of Roman North Africa and Augustine's travels and all those sorts of things, you might take a look at that biography by Peter Brown. As I said, Augustine believes that theology can be personal. And that's a surprising or strange claim. I mean, often when we read theology, what we see is a text that has deliberately left the personal out, right? Because it's trying to describe things that are universally true, and they're true for every human being. And so it seems like you don't need to have something personal on the scene. You don't need to have an individual human being on the scene. It seems like that could just muddy the waters, right? Like if you read, say, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you don't, read Marcia's story in the Catechism. You just read the articulation of the doctrines. But Augustine says basically this. Augustine says, if I want to tell you about God, I have to tell you the story of my life. And one thing that is really fun about Augustine is the way that he recasts the story, the Christian story of creation, fall, conversion, and fulfillment in terms of his own life. So you're going to get to a passage where Augustine is talking about a pear tree, a really famous passage. And when I was 17 reading this passage, I thought, why, Augustine, are you spending so much time telling us about how you grabbed a few pears from your neighbor's tree and stole them, and then spending almost no time telling us about your sexual sins, which, you know, 17, that seemed way more interesting. But I had totally missed the point, right? If Augustine puts himself in a garden with a tree with fruit that he's not supposed to take, that he does take, what should you immediately be thinking of? Yeah, Genesis, the Garden of Eden, right? And so Augustine does this all over the place. He'll take this scene from Scripture and then tell his own story in a way that is evocative of what's going on in Scripture. And so even though none of us have stolen pears from pear trees, I assume, we, by reading his personal story, are taken back to the garden and the way in which we have all fallen short, in the ways in which we have all sinned. And so he has this curious way of bringing the cosmic and the microcosmic together, bringing the theological and the personal together. And as you dig really deep into his story, you find that the whole of the Christian story opens out in front of you. It's not just an idiosyncratic thing. I think we have some sense of what this is like. You know, when someone gives their testimony, the testimony of their conversion, you don't usually leave just thinking, oh, that was an interesting story. You often leave with a greater gratitude for the grace and mercy of God, right? But Augustine is doing that sort of thing in a much bigger and maybe more sophisticated kind of way, telling us one story and showing us that that one story opens us out to the whole of the Christian story. So he says to understand the mysteries of theology, if I'm going to explain the mysteries of theology to you, I should cast them in terms of my own experience. And thus, he invites us quite explicitly to bring our own particularity to the story as well. He often speaks directly to the reader in the text and says, I don't want you to just listen to my story and be unchanged by it. I want you to be invited into this Christian story and see what your role is. Perhaps most of all, this is the last thing I'll say about this point, perhaps most of all, Augustine is trying to understand the connection between his first birth and his second birth. Sometimes when we undergo a dramatic conversion experience, as Augustine does, it's tempting to just want to do away with everything that's gone before, or say, well, that was the time period where I was messed up, and I'm going to focus on now, right? I'm just going to focus on what's ahead. And Augustine says, no, I need to understand the connection between how God is working in my life now and how God has been working in my life in the entire period that went before. So that's another way of explaining what I mean when Augustine says theology can be personal. All right. This book is called The Confessions. And one of your first questions should be, what is a confession? I, at the age of 17, thought I knew what a confession was. I grew up evangelical Protestant, so my category for understanding confession was a little underdeveloped. I thought, I didn't mean that to be a joke, but yeah. I just thought, this is where he's going to lay out all the bad things that he's done. Well, it's a little bit more than that. So the first thing is we need to look at the Latin again. Confession comes from the Latin cum fateor. So fateor means speaking. I speak. And it's deponent. And cum means with. I know there are some Latin people here, so I'm throwing you some things. Okay. So cum fateor, it means speaking with. I mean, just think about a confessional. You don't just go stand out in the snow and yell your confessions to the wind. You go, often when you think about a confessional, you think about going to a priest or to someone else, telling them your sins specifically. So there's always this speaking with, and throughout the text, Augustine is trying to speak with God. And part of what happens when you're speaking with someone is you're also listening and hearing what comes back from them. Confession for for Augustine isn't just saying what is and what is not. It's not just a kind of static recognition. That is to say, Augustine isn't just journaling for us, he isn't just giving us a record of his past. Instead, he thinks as he speaks with God, that something comes out of that interaction, and he comes to understand his past in ways that he didn't understand it before. Let me really underscore that point for you. Augustine thinks there can be a huge difference between how you experience something when you're going through it, and then how you understand it when you're looking back on it. And at the age of 43, he's looking back on things that at the time felt like tremendous successes to him, but now he thinks maybe they aren't such tremendous successes, or things that looked like tremendous failures to him that now maybe don't feel like just tremendous failures to him, or places where he felt like God was totally far from him, but now in looking back he thinks God wasn't totally far from him, and so on. He says there's a change in perspective when you're looking back, and there's a kind of recreation. But Augustine doesn't want to just recreate his life story by himself this time. He wants to create his life story in conversation with God. And I think in that way he provides a really great model for us. So often I think we come to God and say, you know, fix this catastrophe, or help me get through this difficult thing, or, you know, thank you for this beautiful thing that has come into my life. And God says, I'm going to tweak this a little bit. I'm going to invite you to understand it in a slightly different way. And Augustine models for us an openness to that conversation, because we see, he tells us in the text, how he comes to understand things differently once he brings them before God and once he speaks with God about them. So let's take a look at our text. And we're going to look at the very opening paragraph. How are we doing on time? All right, well, we'll talk through a few things here. So I'm going to read a passage, but first let me tell you this. When you're thinking about confessions, you should think about them in three senses. First is confession of sin. That's what we're really familiar with. I did a bad thing. Second is confession of faith. And that sense of confession comes a little less readily to our minds, and yet we all get it, right? We talk, let us confess our faith, right? We confess our faith together. That is to say, we acknowledge what we believe and what we hope for. And finally, Augustine offers confessions of praise. That is, he tells God who he is and who God has been to him. So all those sections that I thought were just pious interludes, just boring prayers that he probably has to put in because he's a bishop and that's what the people want. They're not that. They are all his confessions. And he shows us this threefold sense of confession right in the very opening paragraph of the Confessions. And that's what I'd like to look at with you. And I'm going to ask you where you see it. So confessions of sin, confessions of faith, confessions of praise. So I'm just going to read this first paragraph. It begins with Magnus est Domine. The very first word of the text is great. The very first word of the text is about God. It's an autobiography, but God has the first word. Great are you, O Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense, and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we humans, who are a due part of your creation, long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us, carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans, due part of your creation as they are, still do long to praise you. You stir us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have made us and drawn us to yourself, and our heart is unquiet, or our heart is restless until it rests in you. I'll say, I love this translation. It's the Maria Bolding translation. I think she might be the first woman to have translated this text, and she does it beautifully, except she should have stuck with the old way of saying, our hearts are restless until they find the rest of you. So, I don't know, if you buy your translation, I always have my students just cross it out and write restless. That's all right. But so you tell me where you find confessions of sin, confessions of praise, and confessions of faith in that opening paragraph where Augustine's telling us how to read this book. Where's the mention of sin?
Well, certainly in the second sentence.
That we carry the evidence of our sin.
Right.
Yep. So there's that acknowledgement. Great. And then what about confession of praise?
Yeah, that's the opener and that third sentence.
Right, right. So great are you, you are exceedingly worthy of praise. We long to praise you. And then confessions of faith. I think the confessions of faith is a little bit trickier. Does anyone want to take a stab at it? It's okay if you're wrong, but well, you're probably not wrong. Probably I just haven't seen it yet. But to my mind, the confessions of faith comes out in that very last line. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. That is, to my mind, that's expressive of his faith or his hope that even if he hasn't found even if his heart hasn't found rest yet, it will. That's the promise that God has offered to him. So as you're reading, everywhere, I want you to be looking, or I hope you'll be looking for this threefold confession of sin, faith, and praise. The other thing that I hope you'll watch for as you're reading is the way that almost every sentence quotes or alludes to a biblical text. Especially, I noticed the last time I was reading, the Psalms are just all over the place. Of course, Augustine was praying the Psalms daily, and they just seep in. So one funny thing about this book is, yeah, Augustine wrote it in a certain sense. Well, he didn't write it, he dictated it. So he told people how to write it, but we can still say he wrote it. Augustine wrote it, and you may have been wondering when I was saying, Augustine and God write the story together, you may have been thinking, I don't know how that works. Like, how do you write something with God? Never had that experience of writing something with God. Well, one way that works is that the very words that Augustine uses are the words of Scripture. So when Augustine describes his experience,